Voter suppression never went away. It evolved.
They say to me, well, we thought we had done away with poll taxes. We thought we had done away with intimidation. We have all kind of obstacles being placed in our way. It's the same game with a different name.
To understand how we got here, historian Carol Anderson says we first need to understand white rage.
White rage is not how we often think about it. We often think of rage as being this kind of violent backlash or uproar. We know that there's something wrong with the violence that takes down a child. We know that something is wrong with the violence that 6 dogs on nonviolent protesters in Birmingham. We know something's wrong with that. But the kinds of quiet policies that led to that moment, it takes us a long time to recognize that the policies themselves are predicated on white supremacy and exclusion.
Anderson says the trigger for white rage is Black advancement. For each advancement Blacks made for voting rights, there was an opposite reaction of white rage. That was the case in Mississippi after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to freed Black men.
Because Mississippi said, how do we write a law saying we don't want Black people to vote without writing a law that says explicitly we don't want Black people to vote? Because the 15th Amendment said you can't write a law that's that explicit. What Mississippi did was Mississippi said, we will take the societally imposed conditions on African Americans and use those conditions as the access to the ballot box.
Mississippi passed a new state constitution that required every citizen to pay a poll tax, pass a literacy test, and in some cases, meet a property requirement. At the time, Black people were less than 30 years out of slavery when they earned no money and were blocked from reading. The Mississippi Plan of 1890 was applied equally to Black and white voters, but white men could get around the barriers with so-called grandfather clauses. If they or a relative had voted before the Civil War ended, they could skip the poll tax or literacy test. A Mississippi governor later admitted the provisions had no other purpose than to eliminate Blacks from politics. That's how a blueprint to circumvent the 15th Amendment was created, and other states followed Mississippi's lead. In the Jim Crow era, Black voters were often met by violence. Civil rights workers who helped other African Americans to vote were shot, lynched, or violently harassed by vigilantes and police. And even though the 19th Amendment passed in 1920 to give women the right to vote, by 1940, only 3% of eligible African Americans in the South were registered to vote.
The civil rights movement is one of those moments in American history where the U.S. feels a depth of pride because it overcame something as villainous as Jim Crow. And it took a lot of bodies. It took this kind of moral power of the nonviolent movement. It took grassroots organization and mobilizing. It took Martin Luther King, this hard-earned legislative victory of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The Voting Rights Act was hailed as a defining civil rights legislation of its time. It was especially important because it had an enforcement mechanism the 15th Amendment lacked. Under Sections 4 and 5 of the VRA, states with a history of discriminatory voting laws now needed federal approval or pre-clearance to change their election laws. This gave the Justice Department and federal courts in D.C. power to block discriminatory election laws. Its impact was profound. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among Blacks increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. By then, President Lyndon B. Johnson had established anti-poverty programs to curb inequality. He created Medicare and Medicaid for the elderly and poor and enacted education and housing reforms. By 1966, 85% of whites said the pace of civil rights progress was too fast, and by the 1968 presidential election, white resentment had coalesced into the Southern strategy.
The Southern strategy, bringing Democrats and disaffected whites into the Republican Party
The Southern strategy bolstered racist policies and practices without using racist language. Anderson says this applied to voter suppression as well.
Voter suppression is really based on the Mississippi Plan of 1890, where you can't say, we don't want Black people to vote. But that's the intent. That's been a key element in the policy of now the Republican Party. I would say another key element in policy was uttered by Paul Weyrich.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
To understand the language of voter fraud and voter suppression that's going on now, that's the framework. That our leverage, our power increases when the voting populace is constrained.
When President Ford signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1975, the scope of the bill was expanded to protect Latino, Native American, and Asian voters by requiring bilingual elections. Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 1982, 1992, and 2006. The 2006 renewal included 15,000 pages of evidence of ongoing discrimination in voting. Congress said there was progress in eliminating first-generation barriers to voting, but that second-generation barriers had persisted.
Yes, we have made some progress. We have come a distance. We are no longer met with bullwhips, fire hoses, and violence when we attempt to register and vote. But the sad fact is, the sad truth is, discrimination still exists.
Second-generation barriers were laws that diluted the political power of minorities at the polls and included things like racial gerrymandering, poll closures, voter ID laws, and cutting down early voting and same-day voter registration. On a bipartisan basis, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized for 25 years. 2 years later, in 2008, America elected its first Black president.
The election of Barack Obama is one in the latest string of the advancement of Black folk that leads to this incredible white rage.
In 2010, conservative Tea Party candidates swelled within the Republican Party. From 2011 to 2015, 395 new voting restrictions were introduced in 49 states, many of which were struck down by the Department of Justice. Anderson says the election and then re-election of America's first Black president was a factor behind the voting restrictions.
His advancement was the penultimate advancement, and therefore it was the penultimate affront. I'm not surprised then that in his second term, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 4, which was what they called their pre-clearance provision, U.S. Supreme Court gutted that.
The Shelby ruling released 9 states and several counties from federal oversight and pre-clearance in changing their election laws. Southern states reacted swiftly.
2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Texas implemented its racist voter ID law.
2 months later, North Carolina enacted HB 589, a bill that required strict photo ID requirements, eliminated same-day voter registration, and limited early voting. The U.S. Court of Appeals later struck down the law, saying that it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Since the Shelby ruling, at least 23 states have enacted newly restrictive statewide voter laws, such as voter roll purges, poll closures, and strict voter ID laws. This November, the Republican National Committee and Trump campaign are planning to flood polling locations with poll watchers, claiming to stop widespread voter fraud. A key Trump advisor is heard describing the multi-million-dollar plan in this leaked audio.
Right, traditionally, it's always been Republicans suppressing votes in places. Let's start protecting our voters, right? We know where they are now. We know where they are, and they're all in one part of the state, and their voters are all in one part of the state. So let's start playing offense a little bit, and that's what you're going to see in 2020. I think it's going to be markedly different. It's going to be a much bigger program, much more aggressive program, a much better funded program. And we're going to need all the help we can get.
Since the passing of Congressman John Lewis, the Senate has come under pressure to approve a bill to restore Voting Rights Act protections struck down by the Supreme Court. When the bill passed the House in 2019, 54 years after Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, he said this:
The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society, and people should be able to use it.
We understand that the right to vote is foundational and bedrock in democracy. People are asking themselves, how did we get here?
Voter suppression never went away. It evolved. Left unchecked, it will continue to spread.